Thank you so much for coming today. The structure of today's conversation is going to start off with a brief presentation from Brendan, focusing specifically on these two projects that are within this exhibition. From that, we'll have a little bit of a discussion that's riffing on the themes that emerge from the presentation, and then we'll open it up and sort of have a group discussion about it in the latter third, let's say. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I just feel like I can't. Is it working? Okay. So yeah, thanks. Really close there. Thank you, Matthew, for that. Thank you, Katri and Corinne for the introduction and for the context for what we're going to do today. I'm pretty excited for this because this is different for me than a normal artist talk, so it's a generous experience, and so I'm really looking forward to this. So thank you again for participating and agreeing to this experience. I guess I'll start a little bit about the work that we're sitting in, which is kind of interesting, and just to give a brief outline of my work and how I've kind of conceptualized and considered my work. A lot of my earlier work has dealt specifically with kind of ideas of movement, but movements through cultural migration, the idea of a cultural trajectory. As we heard earlier, my work, my background story is of Kenyan birth, Indian descent, immigrant to Canada, and so the kind of idea of those cultures and how those experiences have attached themselves or affected my way of being. And so a lot of my earlier work has dealt with the kind of questions of loss, memory, forgetfulness, the process of becoming. What does that process of becoming entail when one is put in the context of a constant change? And I feel that identity is something that we're always in an experiential space, that thing can never be static. We are always becoming. And so in that state of becoming, I'm also curious about the idea of what gets left behind. And so as, a Canadian who's lived in, different parts of the world, what does that idea of returning back to Kenya for me as a Kenyan mean? But at one point in my life, I realized that I forgot the language that I grew up with. I spoke fluent Swahili as a second language in the country, but what happened 25 years later was like I just forgot the language. And for me to forget a whole language, a whole tongue, was something of a peculiar nature of change as well. So in the sense that I'm transitioning and becoming other things, I'm also kind of losing things behind. So in that space of return, I'm also really curious about what do I become when I'm in that space when I return. So the piece Faux, which is not in the show, but is actually part of the permanent collection here at the gallery, is a piece where I hired an acting coach to teach me how to speak in my cultural accents. I hired a teacher to teach me how to speak in a Kenyan, Canadian, and Indian accent. And within that space of learning how to speak in those voices of my so-called cultural belonging, I was questioning the idea of authenticity. Like, am I more authentic to myself? Am I more Kenyan? Am I more Canadian? Like, I'm fifth generation born in Kenya, but I've never been to India until last year, but I'm the first in my family to go to India. And so these kinds of ideas of cultural speculation or cultural authenticity were part of that work. But then it's also about this dynamic of power between the teacher and the mentor. And so this woman is teaching me how to speak and become more of myself. But within that action, it becomes this sort of vulnerable act. And then the passage I'm learning is a passage from a book called Faux, written by Jim Coetzee, who's a South African writer. And in the book, it's a sequel to Robinson Crusoe, where a woman named Suzanne is stranded on an island with Robinson Crusoe and Friday. And she says to Crusoe, Friday the primitive is an imbecile. He does not speak. And Crusoe responds, he does not speak because they, this anonymous they, cut out his tongue. So I'm reciting this passage where I'm saying that they cut out my tongue. And so in the sequel to the piece, which is in the entrance of the gallery, is a piece called Performing Faux, where I took whatever I retained from the teacher, and now I'm teaching a group of students how to speak in this way. The piece is not forming the full passage from Faux, and I've edited the piece in a way that it becomes more like a Dada sound poem, but I'm playing this game of Simon Says, where I'm asking them to sort of follow my body gestures, and so when I do certain gestures, to kind of cue them how to make a sound, they start to follow. But it's about this idea of teacher mentorship, this idea of the relationship of that social power dynamic between the two. Encomium is a piece that returns me back to my past and my practice as a dancer. I danced ballet for a number of years, and then I left the ballet world to the lack of a desired body that I didn't obtain. And so I left the ballet world and I danced in the other form of dance, modern dance. And as a modern dancer, there was allowance to be who I was, but the dance technique is still very steeped in a very technical history. And I tore my hamstring dancing Martha Graham technique when I was 22. So in a breakup to dance, I just stopped dancing because I physically was broken. But I also decided that I just didn't want to participate in this anymore. So this you're sitting in is my entry back into it. It's a touching point, and I've done more dance work now, and we're becoming better friends. But it's still a tentative relationship where I'm sort of questioning my body and how does it feel within this space. But the piece Encomium is about a breakup between two lovers, but also the breakup between one's body. And looking at it through the writing of Plato's The Symposium, where Plato invites different philosophers in this imagined or perhaps real gathering of people to speak about love. He asks each philosopher to write a letter about love. And I'm specifically looking at the letter of love that Phaedrus writes, where he says that love is asymmetrical, that love can never fully form. And he looks at it through the metaphor of the relationship between a young boy and his teacher, male lover. And in this love relationship, the boy will eventually grow up and leave his mentor. And so in this piece, I'm looking at the kind of language of dance and the lack of language that we have. And I've written scores in these poster multiples that are in these plinths that give directions about how to make the performance using the language of ballet, but also looking at it through this idea that these two bodies come together and they have to hold a position, this ballet position, for as long as they can in this embrace or this battle until they can't do it anymore. And so for me, it's this idea of more will come out in our discussion, but I'm just trying to think about this idea of these two bodies coming together to create this embrace, but in that there will always be the breakup because your own body will fatigue and cannot labor anymore. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can sort of go from there.
Okay, so can you guys hear me if I don't use the mic? Is that okay? This is sort of awkward. So just before we go into sort of some of the questions that are emerging for me here, do you want to just quickly describe what happened on Wednesday night
Sure.
during the opening of the exhibition?
On Wednesday night, before at the opening, I invited two male dancers to come and perform one of the Encomiums. So we had them. Normally, the process of the dance is an endurance piece, and so it normally takes place for about 2 to 3 hours. So we had the dancers here for the duration of the opening, and they performed Encomium I, so we have the index of their trajectory. On the floor is a Morse code pattern that translates to the words eros, desire, and love, which are the words of love that Phaedrus describes in his Encomium. So the dancers come and they place themselves against each end of these phrases, and this becomes their pathway to kind of guide themselves. And actually right where we are is kind of where they would create the position. And they hold the position for as long as they can in this sort of like embrace and battle. And it's quite interesting to have a body in a gallery space, because when you have the body, when we see dance, I'm really curious about that space of labor that happens when a performance or a dancer is on stage. There's a sort of a limited kind of sense. You don't see the body fatiguing. You just see the body in a sense of fortitude. But like when you have them right here and you can see them, you can see muscles twitching. You can hear them breathing. You can hear them gasping. You can smell them. There's a certain kind of relationship between your body and their body. And so the process of them coming together, holding for as long as they can, and then breaking apart. So this breakup happens, and then they go back And then there's this moment of intense stoppage where they have to stop and think about the process of what's happening in their body, but they have to connect with each other, and then they come back to form the position again. So repetition is a way that we teach our bodies how to, it's the exercise of learning how to understand the dance and know how to take the dance so that we can perform it again, but it's also the way that we become fatigued and tired.
So, so on Wednesday night, these two dancers continuously repeated the same gesture in this space until they became fatigued.
Yeah, and I think that the fatigue starts right away from the beginning act, right? So it just kind of continues to happen, but it gets shorter, and it gets it becomes more like, you can see the kind of like durational aspect of time and how time is now affecting the body. Mm-hmm. So, I think from the first position, like all the positions that I'm giving them, like any dancer can do, but it's the idea to hold them, and in ballet you have to hold the position. It's like, so I don't think I think fatigue happens or pain happens right away, but there's also the sense of pain and pleasure within it as well.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a good place to start, I think. I think that there's an interesting transit between these two pieces. And so at first I'd like to talk about the two pieces in conjunction with one another, and sort of the meanings that, the things that performing folk picks up a number of threads within your broader practice. This picks up another couple of threads within your broader practice. I'm really interested in your case in the sort of intersectionalities of the research that you and the thinking that you're doing around identity formation in transit as caused by moving between different cultural situations. We can go into it later, but we talked about this W.E.B. Du Bois as a theorist within the sort of studies of African American studies and diasporic studies. That is something that embodiment of cultural identity and returning to cultural identity is something that comes up a lot in performing folk. On the other hand, there's an embodiment that takes place in this. But it's ballet, which is this very Western structure, and the thematic is more in the axis of a sort of a queer performing of a text. So, just to sort of start to try and weave in between these two like major subject areas in your work. As a general, what are the connections between identity as cultural formation and as identity as the subject position of queerness?
Well, I guess first and foremost, I think that for me to define queer in my definition, queer is a term that I feel as being an open moniker for inclusion. And within that inclusion, I feel that it's a term that has many ruptures and doesn't necessarily need to be defined. So it's kind of in that same process of becoming, for me. That is, and within that, I'm thinking about queerness also so I think that of course there's obvious like differences between some of the post-colonial work and then the work that deals with a queerness through like a dance background. But within it, I still feel there's a lot of relations. I think because within the work, I'm constantly thinking about my practice as a practice that's looking at the dynamics of power relationships, and within like ethnic cultures, but also then through subcultures. And ballet also is a very cultural. It's a very French. It's part of a very French culture, but the way that it's sort of disseminated through a history of how it's become, ballet started as a way to bow to Louis XIV in his court, and through that history, he then created he then made it into an art form and started the first school of ballet. But then I'm also curious about how that dance is then proliferated into, other forms like the Russian ballet, because other courts then took it on, like the British court, the Italian court, but eventually then it became what we know it as a dance form, like as ballet through the Russians, but then also how communism then has changed it through the Cuban ballet or the Chinese ballet, because they became political gestures. So the political implications of that kind of idea of movement for me also comes to this space of movement, movement as being like a social, political engagement as well, not just the idea of idea of migration, of the idea of like moving a trajectory or the movement of an actual dance. So I think that in that, I'm really, in all of this work, what brings it together is the idea that I'm looking at dynamics of social hegemonies and the kind of dynamics of power within those spaces. And also then thinking about it through subcultural. And I think like in some of my newer work looking at dance, I'm looking at how the sort of dynamic between like even ballet as being the Western form of a classical kind of form of dance, but then how modern is always seen as like the othered form, but also how in museums, for example, many African objects, masks, I do a lot of work with masks, those objects have been part of a colonial process where those objects have been taken from their place of origin, placed in a museum, but as you place them in the museum, we remove their bodies. We don't have that masquerade that was part of its experience. Its lived experience was an actual moving, participating object, but now in the museum it's just sort of still. And stillness becomes a place of question as a space of labor as well within the kind of pieces. Like when I'm making these dancers come together and create a position, their living sculptures asked to be still and to hold it for as long as they can. But that stillness then is a question of that power dynamic as well.
Okay, so thinking about embodiment and particularly becoming, one sort of major connection I see between the two works and the thematic of this show is that in the case of pronunciation in this piece, in performing faux, and in the medium of ballet in this piece, these languages, these established languages are used as containers for a transit of becoming. The transit in that in performing faux is a return to a lost identity. You focus a lot in the video. Of course, in the second piece, there's less focus on your actual physical mouth movement, but in a sense, a lot of what I interpret in that work is returning to a cultural embodiment, less.
Or a desire. I think it's also like a desire, like this kind of idea of like, because this idea of like, am I more, like off this because I can do it?
Because I'm moving.
Or I'm mimicking, this kind of idea of like trying to be, and so it's almost like a fakery or something. Because I also know like when I met the acting coach, it was this thing where she said, oh well, when I called her like a blind call, and I said to her like, can you teach me how to speak a Kenyan, Canadian, and Indian accent? And she said, well I can. And she said, you speak a fluent Canadian accent, which also, what is a Canadian accent? Because accent changes through region, through class, through many other things. So what is accent in many forms? So again, and then she said, but she's like, well, you speak with an Indian musicality, but she's like, the Canadian is really pushing through because you have this Irish lilt. And I was like, what does she mean Irish lilt? She's like, you sound Irish when you say your R's. And then she said, it's probably because you're from a part of Canada which is settled by the Irish, possibly in Ontario. I would say maybe in the area of Waterloo, and like that's where my family grew up, like 20 minutes from there. So there's this kind of thing where like so within that she's reading into the guy who was filming me was like, oh, listen to me, where am I from? It was this kind of like, tell me more. But it was this thing that like, how does she understand me through my voice? But also like, because at first I thought it was just gonna be caricature. She's gonna give me like, am I gonna sound like, like is she gonna give me like a very like like, you know, stereotypical Indian accent to perform, but she went into like the dialogue and she was like, okay, you're from a Portuguese background, from this area of India, let's go into this. So we went into like really specifics.
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess I'm going off track, but the things that she really, for me, was this idea of desire to, am I going to be more of this in this space, you know? But like, you know, it's kind of like, I'm just, because if you watch Foe, I'm totally struggling. Like I look like a total idiot, you know?
You look a little scared.
I'm petrified. I'm also exhausted, and so
Yeah.
exhaustion is something because she made me do 8 hours per accent.
Yeah.
So we had to do 8 hours of training before we could do. So I physically, you know, the mind-body relationship that happens in a dance piece, where your head is trying to comprehend what is happening, but then your body has to express it, was happening. And she's saying, move the air this way, project the air that way. If the air is touching your teeth, you're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, where's it? So like I'm having this thing. I'm like, where's the air hitting? Like I don't know where it's touching. And like, and I'm totally, like, and my face is pretty expressive in general. So I just look like I'm going to cry or something. And in that moment of fear or vulnerability or insecurity that reads on film, you know, it gives the audience this kind of entry to laugh because you feel uncomfortable as well. And I think that's why Faux kind of works. I think in a piece like this, there's the same thing happening. And I'm playing on that, but it then becomes more visceral because you're seeing it in live. That's in the live performance is what I'm thinking about. But when you watch it in the videos, and I've also been particularly specific on how I filmed it and how I edited it, it becomes more romanticized. This becomes how we watch things on stage. This is no different. So that's why this is a work that is different from the live. When you watch them, like, you know, everyone says, oh, how can you make them do these things? You're so cruel, which possibly I am. But the thing is that, you know, when I'm actually, maybe I'm giving myself credit here that I don't deserve, is like I'm freaking out. Like I'm very anxious when they're here because I know that they're going through something, and maybe also because that's my lived experience as a former dancer. I know the kind of questions of pain because it always bothers me when people don't acknowledge the body, and for me that's part of what this is the valuing of our bodies as performers, as dancers, as workers, as cultural workers. I'm really curious about the space of our labor and our value.
So the hour that you're referring to is cultural workers in this case, or a general public?
I think I'm just, in general, I'm thinking about just value of labor, but I'm talking about in that hour, these dancers moving in the space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you show a excerpt of film?
Sure.
Yeah.
For those who don't know the piece.
This is my new webpage. You should all go to it. And I don't know how to use it.
Let's
Let's go around.
It's reverse scroll.
Okay. I was like,
Where is it? Do you see it?
there.
What are you doing?
It's Friday and imbecile. It's Friday and imbecile. It's Friday and imbecile. Of speech. It's Friday and imbecile incapable of speech. I asked, is that what you meant to tell me? Friday. Crucial motion Friday near. Open your mouth, he told him. He opened his own. Friday opened his mouth, looked at Crusoe. A look but saw nothing in the dark, save the glint of teeth, white as ivory. Dark.
You head into that British thing and you don't come back.
Dark. The glint of teeth, white as ivory.
Hit that R harder. Ivory. There you go.
Ivory. Teeth white as ivory. Teeth white as ivory. Teeth white as ivory. La 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 la, said Crusoe, and motioned Friday to repeat.
Maybe we'll
Dancing
stop
Crusoe,
there.
Emotion Friday
But
beat.
you can watch the rest on my webpage if you like.
In the back of his story.
Not super loud.
Whoa, it got louder. So I want to pick up on this idea of labor and the feeling of labor. Somewhere in an interview or on one of your web pages or something, you said that you were interested, again, in becoming in labor and becoming undone, being towards movement and the Marxist imaginary and the space of social movement. Sorry, the context is not present in that statement, but hopefully it triggers something. And at another point, you refer to movement or excessive movement as something that is often othered in certain discourses. An otherness in terms of like an otherness of like a savage otherness or a wildness. Where is this tracking to in a sort of an idealized project in terms of labor and movement in tandem together?
I don't know if there is an ideal project, or I think it's constantly something that I'm thinking about, and within that, those ruptures allow for other things to happen and exist. I think that labor for me is something that I'm curious about because I'm looking at it through the performance gesture of how are we seen as laboring within that actual act of being on stage, and where we look like we're effortless. Specifically thinking about ballet. With ballet, the body can't look strong. Even though the body is very strong, you have to look as if you are in a state of otherness. Mm-hmm. And like even the idea of being on point and dancing in your toes, it's supposed to be like this sort of effortless existence. And then when you think about also, and like most West African dance, or which is where most masquerade comes from, to be up on your toes is to be up higher with the other spiritual gods. So you can see a lot of costuming and stuff. You're always higher. So that's like the kind of idea of going to like another world. So that is something that I'm sort of thinking about as a kind of idea of like transcending that existence of reality, but also then thinking about it through the idea of otherness or labor in the space of stillness. So like Andre Lepecki is a cultural theorist who says that the dance can't exist without movement. The body has to be in constant motion, and without movement, then there is no dance. And I'm really curious about that space of stillness, because stillness still is a space of enactment, where the body is still participating, is still fully engaged. And so thinking about that within sort of a Marxist context, I'm thinking about the idea that within the pyramid structure of a ballet company, you have corps de ballet dancers who are, will stand in a certain position in Swan Lake and be in that position still for like 20 minutes while the principals and the soloists are moving. So the higher you get up in that system of the classical ballet structure, you have more allowance to move. So that freedom for me is in question, because even though there's an allowance to move, that's not really a freedom, because they're still actively laboring. All parties are laboring, so it's a strange kind of idea of freedom. But I'm also really curious about the idea of stillness as something that just sort of gets seen as being idle or being wasted. Mm-hmm. So there's dancers who are still in positions because your body is still physically moving. You might not look like it. Like even in these positions, when I ask you to stay still, you can see them. So when you're up close, you can see them sort of shaking. So the idea of stillness being a space of labor that is still active. Something that you kind of mentioned, and I might be going on a tangent, is this idea of otherness. And so physically, and ballet asks for a specific kind of body type. And in the history of ballet, there has always been a lack of bodies of color. Mm-hmm. And the lack of bodies of color come because also of the kind of the trajectory of where that dance started, but also of the desired body, of what kind of body is wanted. So when I danced, my feet were always never accepted. They didn't like my feet. That was why I was not, they didn't want me to dance, because I don't have the desired arch. And so as a child, I used to bind my foot in a device. I'll show you the project. I'm really interested in foot fetish and dance, which also then translates to this other kind of questions of queering. So that's the device I used to use as a child. It's a wooden device that you place on your foot, and you stretch your foot and you bind it so that it takes that shape. And so I created a solo where I'm dancing with this object. And so sort of thinking about that idea of like having a body that is unattained, or so I'm thinking then also like in the history of American ballet theater, there's only been 3 principal dancers of color. And this year, Misty Copeland was the first female principal to be named. And and something that's really curious to me is that and Misty is a colleague and a friend of mine, but she's always been told that her body is too strong. And what does that mean to have a body that's too strong? Even in terms of a feminist statement, like her. So I'm actually making work with her about this thing, but it's because her body doesn't fit that mold, that she can't physically. So as much as her body is she's such an athlete, she has a body that can physically do all the things that the quote unquote perfect desired ballerina can do. And it's like a really,
it almost, the effortlessness is not as convincing because
she's
the
too
sheer
athletic.
power of,
She's too athletic, and I've heard people say, they're like, well, you should dance with Alvin Ailey, you should dance in Martha Graham, because those are the other forms of dance, and because you have too many curves, it doesn't look good on stage, like this kind of that whole thing. And so there's that part of it, but then there's this other part, right? Like in Swan Lake, the White Swan has to do a solo where it's a very rigorous solo, but within that solo she has to do 36 souhaité turns. So it's like a very rigorous turn that you and you have to do 36 in a row, and it's very fast. And Misty has never been able to do it because she has breasts. It turned like this kind of thing in her physical body. So there's a truth and there's a not. It's complicated, but I'm just curious about that kind of idea of like how we've created a certain index for the body in something like ballet of a desire, and within that desire comes then this power dynamic as well. Where you have like a ballet master. Even like the wording of how you call your teachers and stuff. There's this kind of hierarchy within that kind of creates this relationship between a relationship of trust, but also a relationship that will also kind of like break you down physically and mentally as well. So there's that thing. I think I took a class recently where I just was standing in a very, like I'm doing it right now, very easy first position. The teacher came to me and she turned my hips and she said, "You have more in you." She's like, if you're gonna be in my class, you're gonna work at 100% or don't be here. And there's this kind of idea, there's that kind of like sadomasochistic kind of quality to it as well that I'm playing within that kind of power.
which you're perpetuating by making people
making them do it
repeat
over.
the same gesture until,
Which I do feel uncomfortable doing, but I do still do it, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about the 2 dancers that were here on Wednesday. You mentioned to me sort of an interest in Lacan's mirror stage, and ultimately this piece is about a relationship or relationships that are unbalanced. Can you sort of talk a little bit more about that? Like the fact you've chosen 2 male dancers in each case. I mean, is a physical similarity important? Where in the choice of gender does this mirroring sort of fall?
Well, I think it's self-referential, and I think that when you talk about Lacan and mirror stage, I think this piece, Encomium, comes from the idea of me trying to really figure out my relationship with my own self and my own body as an injured dancer who's now old and who's trying to figure out where that space is. Like even within the space of directing dancers. Like I was always told how to move. And now I'm telling people how. I was told how to move. Now I'm telling people how to move. It's a really strange space. Mm-hmm. And so I think that having the two male dancers come together, it's sort of like a mirroring of me kind of just sort of thinking of my old self and my quote unquote realization of who I was and trying to find the new space of myself. And so like it has been performed with two women, but I kind of like that dynamic of the two males because I reference it specifically in the Encomium speeches of Plato. But I'm really interested in the idea of them being a mirroring of power that is actually a mirroring with myself. Like when I tell them, I said when I give them instructions, I always say like I feel like you guys, there's a battle between you two, but there's also a companionship. But what is the real battle is the battle between yourself and your body. Like if I'm doing it, if I just sort of like feel within myself that I can hold it a little bit longer, there is that extra like that power to allow me to do it a bit longer. It's like and so because you decide when you're going to stop. You know, like it's not like the other person says you stop now. You break the position when you can't do it anymore. So there's this real internal sense of you working through your moment. So there's again that kind of relationship between cerebral and then what is expressed from the outside. And the reason I brought this project up is because Encomium was sort of like a footnote or the beginnings of what then became this project, which is a video piece called Seeing Eye, a video animation, which is a conversation, a dialogue between two elephants, one's Indian and one's African, and they're both gay elephants breaking up with each other. So it's this very kind of like strange, perverse sort of dialogue of like, do you love my trunk anymore? Like how many like do you remember holding trunks? And so it gets in this kind of strange conversation, but then you realize that they're talking to themselves, and there's a lot of like dialogue between like, am I seeing you? Are you seeing me? And it kind of goes through this kind of like grinder scruff conversation where they're kind of texting each other these things like, can I see your trunk? You know,
Yeah.
Well, I'll
Is
show
that
you
the
mine.
start of their relationship?
Oh, Matthew. Perhaps the beginning of the new relationship. But it ends up being this kind of breakup to sort of just ends where it's this realization that it's actually the same creature looking at itself. Because I like the dynamic between the African elephant and the Indian elephant because the two pachyderms, have such similar like profiles that they look like they're mirroring each other, but they are different animals.
So, for those of us that aren't familiar with it, because I'm actually not, can you briefly summarize Lacan's mirror phase and how it relates or differs from narcissism, which is something that many a gay man is accused of, dating themselves?
We talked about that a little bit inside. Well, in Lacan's mirror stage, she says that there's a moment in your life and he specifically references to a child, and this is, I'm giving like the Cole's notes here, that a child or won't be able, doesn't recognize themselves in a mirror. And there's a certain moment when there's a realization like, that's me, that aha moment. And in that moment, that child can never be that person that it was, that it has a new experience, and then it recognizes itself. And humans are one of the only animals that can recognize themselves in mirrors. There's other few animals that can do that. Elephants are one of them. And so, but that idea that once you realize that that's you in the mirror, or in that reflection, there's a sense of change. So there's kind of going back to the idea of becoming. There's the idea of that you can't go back to that space.
So it's an awareness of
you
look like from the exterior, that you have a faciality.
Yes, but also that faciality, there's also that experience that, this is me. And there's a new kind of realization of the person that you can't ever go back.
So in these texts, and the performers I've always interpreted as lovers, but a possible second read of it could be an individual meeting themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And that's why I think that space of coming together of these lovers is important, but then there's that space of the individual person in that space actually having their own realization, which then becomes the breakup, which is that, and then they move forward to come back again. They have to repeat it. But there is this kind of idea that they are working with each other, but it's really about the individual in that space.
Maybe we should read them.
Sure. You want to read one?
I'll read one if you read one.
Okay. Should I just stand up and read one?
Yeah.
His beloved resists the passionate advances of his lover. His lover praises him for his youth, beauty, and virtue. His beloved is won over. They advance facing one another in a slow but confident walk. They pay their right leg a la Sagan. The lover takes the left hand of his beloved. They raise their right arms to the fifth position. They wait until they release. The lover loves his beloved. His beloved never loved his lover. They walk away.
And that's in that screen is a performance of that text. So each of these texts, which you can take with you, is a reflection of the performance. And so mine, which is that screen. These are all shot in Toronto at Diaz Contemporary. The lover pursues his beloved through his wisdom. His beloved supplies his lover with physical beauty. The lover aims to teach his beloved. They advance facing one another in a slow but confident walk. They grand plie connecting their eyes. The lover takes the hands of his beloved, crisscrossing them in opposition. They releve onto demi-point. They are stabilized until they separate. The lover loves his beloved. His beloved never loved his lover. They walk away.